Welcome to the British Foreign Policy Group. My name is Sophia Gaston. I'm the director here. It's a great pleasure. Today we have Professor Mark Kenny. He's from the Australian Studies Institute at the Australian National Universities, one of the absolute top universities in Australia. Mark, before he came to academia, had a very long and illustrious career as a political journalist across many very well-known publications. And has been a real fixture in Australia's media scene for some time. Today we're going to talk through Australia's handling of the pandemic. Australia, as some of you may know, has had quite a unique experience. It seems to have once again proven itself to be the lucky country. So we're just going to talk about how that came to be and maybe just contextualize it as well a little bit with the national politics that's going on and Australia's very particular relationship with China. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Sophia.
So just to kick things off, let's talk about some of the structural advantages that Australia may have had coming into this, because it seems to me that the way in which, the timing of the pandemic hitting sort of at the end of summer, not necessarily because of the weather, but because you've got a very fit and healthy population, the health system's not under any particular strain. There's also the way in which people live in Australia, quite a prosperous society. People live in detached homes, they drive their own cars. I wonder if you could just talk us through some of those kinds of, those structural factors that might have played a role into the way in which the pandemic has landed in Australia.
Yes, well, it is interesting, Sophia, to look at it from that perspective, because I guess that does mark Australia out differently from many other communities. You don't want to overplay these things, because in the cities, there's plenty of medium and high density living as well. But it is true that we're an enormous country in terms of space, and we have quite big cities in terms of spread. A lot of people do live in their own houses, which are completely unattached. And as you say, they commute. A lot of people commute via roads and so forth. So there are a whole range of ways in which, I guess, the habits of people in Australia, particularly, as you say, at this time of year when the weather is better, sort of tend to not to make people, in close proximity with each other. That's certainly a factor. And also we do have a very good health system. There's a lot of talk, obviously, in the UK about the value of the NHS, and we've all seen the images of people coming out onto the street to clap NHS workers. We've seen what Boris Johnson has had to say about it, particularly moving after his own near-death experience. But we in Australia, of course, have a similar thing called Medicare. We'd probably say it's better resourced, and we have, therefore, very strong culture of strong universal healthcare here. Now, that said, it's not like it's perfect, and there doesn't appear to have been a huge amount of excess capacity in our hospitals or in our ICUs. But for a range of reasons, including some of those we've just discussed, our hospital system so far, and it looks like it's going to go this way, has not been put under the sort of pressure that we've seen health systems put under in many, many other countries.
And what about the political dimensions of this? Because Scott Morrison, obviously the Prime Minister, came into this rather wounded. He had had that horrific experience over the bushfires. His handling had been quite universally criticised. Do you think that there was a sense amongst his team that they couldn't afford to mishandle another crisis, and maybe that played a role in sort of him getting on the front foot?
I absolutely agree with that. In fact, I'd probably put it a different way, but it doesn't, these aren't mutually exclusive. I do think he couldn't afford that. He bungled, basically, the bushfires. As you know, they were news all around the world, those fires raging in so many parts of Australia, right down the eastern seaboard in particular. And the scale of the fires, the ferocity of them, was truly shocking here in Australia, as well as it was around the world. And the Prime Minister, while that was going on, went off to Hawaii for a week-long holiday. At that stage, it seemed like he hadn't appreciated how just how big these fires were, how comprehensive the emergency was. And his office didn't even say that he was leaving the country. They attempted to hide this fact. So it was a terrible look. He came back, and, there were then those vision, you may have seen it, of him trying to sort of shake the hands of emergency services workers or shattered community members, and there were problems with that. And he made some comments, he said, well, the Prime Minister doesn't actually fight the fires, I'm not on the end of the hose, which is a funny comment really, because a previous Liberal Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, actually was on the end of a hose and was on the end of a hose when he was Prime Minister. So, that's interesting in itself, probably just a curio, I suppose. But going back to your question, I think the distinction I'd make with it is just simply to say that it wasn't just that he couldn't afford another bungled, handling of an emergency. I think he actually knew that he needed to, if this was going to be addressed, it needed to be done properly from the start. He needed to actually really learn from leaving it to others, as he had in the bushfire crisis, and take charge. This was a whole new character of thing, as we all know, all around the world, and it did require a national leader to step up. And there's a sense, if you look at it in the very sort of positive way, there's a sense in which it has made Scott Morrison into a leader in the way that the bushfire showed that he wasn't. And that's quite fascinating to watch. Now, how that plays out as this crisis proceeds and in the aftermath, that is of great interest here. But we'll just have to wait and see on that.
And obviously we're seeing a lot of footage at the moment coming over from the US, where there are some quite sort of raucous protests, these sort of conservative-driven protests that are sort of springing up around in states, trying to bring heat and pressure on national governors to reopen. Australia is also a federal system, obviously from the vantage point of Britain, where we're so centralised. This is a very curious system for us. Why do you think things seem to have worked so well in Australia's federal system? Because it is true that you do have different different parties in power in different states and at a federal level.
Yeah, it's a very good question, because the Federation and reform of the Federation, the functioning of the Federation in Australia has been a kind of an ongoing friction point, a sort of centre of a lot of complaint for a long time, because there are tensions that exist between the two levels of government, the state and the federal government. And so it'd be reasonable to expect that at this moment, those tensions would hamper the national effort. And we've seen that as the case in the US. But here, it seemed like everyone realised quite quickly, perhaps not as quickly in some areas as others. So, Scott Morrison was slower in some ways. He was advocating people go to the football, for example, on a particular weekend at the same time as he was announcing what were the first, and at that stage, quite modest bans, which was a proposal to prohibit unnecessary public groupings of people more than 500. But even as he was announcing that, he was defending the idea that on that particular weekend, he was going to be going to the football, and he encouraged other people who weren't unwell in any way to do likewise. So there's been a psychological journey that he's made and that a number of people have made. But I think what they did do quite well, quite quickly, was that they named this thing called the National Cabinet. And that was made up of the state premiers, which would be called governors in the US system, and the state premiers and the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, the leadership of the national government, meeting at least twice a week. And they've been conversing, using Zoom and various other things every day, phone calls and the like. And this National Cabinet has actually worked. So in a strange kind of way, a whole lot of problems of the Federation have been kind of bypassed, and in some cases perhaps even resolved by the common emergency of this COVID crisis. And you'd say probably the opposite has been the case in the US, where the president has been, a big part of the problem, a disaster really. And the competition, the fact that it's happening in an election year, that Trump's desperate to get re-elected and so forth, all of these things have come together to make it a terrible situation in the US. Whereas in Australia, and admittedly, we're only talking about 6 states and 2 territories, so much smaller number of governors or premiers, as we call them here, that need to be wrangled. But there's been very much a sense that they're all in the same peloton. There's some variations in the way they've run some of their restrictions in terms of school closures and some of those other things, but by and large, it's been a high level of agreement and coordination, and it's worked very well.
It strikes me that there's something, sort of perhaps another challenge looming for Australia on the horizon. If it is the lucky country, if it has sort of come out of this first wave of the pandemic in a much better position than pretty much every other Western nation in particular, that could also be quite a lonely experience. I mean, what happens if Australia is sort of doing okay, domestic travel and so on resumes, its economy can kickstart, but many of its trading partners and certainly all of its Western allies are still very stricken with this. Is there any kind of commentary about what happens for Australia in the aftermath of all of this?
There certainly is. There's a great deal of concern about that, and there's a gradual realisation, I think, on the part of the community that all of this talk about lifting restrictions, for example, that we see that pressure all around the world. And we see Trump, for example, talking about lifting restrictions even as they're having thousands of people die every day. It's amazing. But here there is the same sort of discussion. When can these restrictions be lifted, particularly as we get to a situation where we're getting like 2 or 3 or 5 or 7, these sorts of single figure numbers of new infections per day. And in some jurisdictions, the ACT where I'm sitting, or South Australia or places like that, they'll go for days now without having a single new infection. So it's adding to the public, I guess, slowly at this stage, but there's an impatience building for a lifting of these restrictions. But coming with it is the realisation now that you can only do that if you keep the borders closed. And it is an island nation, and so we have that natural moat, I suppose. But it's also an economy that is built very much on exporting, very much on international trading. And there's an economic question there, and there's also just the prospect that we are going to be, perhaps in for a long period of time where we do have, some restrictions lifted and some relatively free movement within Australia and New Zealand, importantly, and that's part of the story as well. New Zealand's been following an elimination strategy, so they've had even tougher social distancing restrictions than Australia. We've been on what we call a suppression strategy. Our suppression strategy has worked virtually as well as New Zealand's elimination or eradication strategy. So they're both getting to the same point. And there's a bit of talk about allowing free movement between the two nations down here at the bottom of the world, but remaining closed everywhere else. What's that going to do economically? How long can we do it? How long will that go before it's really starting to damage the Australian economy? These are unknown questions, I suppose, but they're. I guess it's a bit like a coach saying, "Well, I've got 3 or 4 people who are looking for selection for the team. It's 3 or 4 people who can make a really good case for it. It's a good position to be in." Australia is probably happy to be in this position. It's a sort of problem you'd rather have than thousands of people dying and your health system overwhelmed and so forth.
Absolutely. I just want to finish now asking about China, because there does seem to be quite an active growing movement in the West to hold China to account for its rather authoritarian behavior and its lack of transparency, particularly in the opening stages of the crisis. I've seen that Maurice Payne, your foreign minister, has come out this week joining calls from the United States and the United Kingdom, actually, for there to be an independent inquiry into China's behavior. Australia's relationship with China has been on quite a journey, and it hasn't been in an especially good place over the past year. Where do you think things are going to go on the other side of this? We did see the CCP come out in response to Maurice Payne saying that Australia was in lockstep with the United States and sort of being a kind of laphound and so on. But where do you see things going on that?
It is a very interesting question, that one, Sophia, because it's a big tension point, and it seems to be getting worse. I mean, today The Prime Minister has backed Peter Dutton, who's the Home Affairs Minister. The Home Affairs Minister has a lot of power, has a big consolidated portfolio. He's one of what we call China hawks in the government. He's quite bullish about muscling up against China in a whole range of ways, and is sort of using some fairly strong rhetoric. The Prime Minister has backed Dutton today. So I think the Australian government is taking the view that China needs to be accountable for this. It needs to at least be transparent, if not accountable. It needs to allow inspectors in to have, or investigators in to have a look around and see what did bring this virus about, what were the circumstances, what were the early responses and so forth. Now, it's not surprising that China's not so happy about that. And Scott Morrison's been counselling or taking calls with other international leaders, including Donald Trump and Angela Merkel and others, trying to gather support for this idea of giving the WHO or a similar body kind of similar powers to weapons inspectors, so that they would literally be able to, kind of demand access, and that there would be consequences for member states that didn't cooperate in circumstances where those investigators were finding that, there was a situation that could lead to the kind of calamitous pandemic situation that we now find ourselves in. So it's not endearing Australia to China, and China is Australia's, largest trading partner. A good deal of the explanation for why Australia was also the lucky country during what we call the GFC and what's often called in the Northern Hemisphere the Great Recession. A good deal of the explanation for that, apart from some pretty imaginative stimulus spending, was the fact that China kept growing and China kept being a big customer for Australian exports and delivering wealth. So the relationship with China is a very difficult one for Australia. Economically, huge engagement, huge interaction. Politically, quite troubled at this stage.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Mark. This has been incredibly enlightening. We're obviously in the eye of the storm still very much over here, and it's fascinating to hear about how this is playing out elsewhere around the world. We will obviously be very keen to see how Australia's experience evolves, particularly because we must remember as well over here that Australia will be going into its own winter and flu season over the coming months. So hopefully we can check in again soon on that. But until now, Professor Mark Kenny, thank you very much.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.